Are we slaves if God created us for his purposes and his designs and we have no say in the matter? After all, we didn't ask to be born, we didn't ask to be created and put in God's universe for his story to tell and his purposes. This was posed to me by an atheist, and he said, by definition, that was slavery. We're going to be diving into that question today. Welcome to another episode of the Unapologetic Apologists. I'm your host, Stillman Smith Jr. With me today is John Dunphy. And I host this apologetics channel. John Dunphy has one if you're here on his channel. And, I try to interview different apologists, have, dialogues about, some deep ideas, deep discussions, big ideas in apologetics and philosophy. But I also try to make it accessible to Christians who are new to apologetics. Now, this episode, again, we're going to be diving into this idea. This is really what provoked it, was this objection that by definition we're slaves if God created us for his purpose with us having no say in the matter. That was kind of what propelled this episode, but I do want to discuss mainly purpose and a lot of ideas that I've gotten from Andrew Klavan over the past several episodes he's done on the Andrew Klavan Show over on the Daily Wire. And so, I have something written here. It's kind of rough. I'm going to be, going a lot off the notes that I have here. But real quick, if you're new to this channel, please consider subscribing, hitting that notification bell. The best thing you can do, actually, for the algorithm is comment. And if you leave a comment and your comment makes an argument for Christianity or theism and it's sufficiently absurd, it commits all tons of logical fallacies and begs the question, then we'll read it live on air because it'll just fit in with the rest of the content that we have here already.
You mean it fits well with your content, full of logical errors and everyone under the book, every logical fallacy under the book.
Under the book, what does that mean?
Oh wait, no, I'm trying to think. I heard it from a phrase. It's a phrase from a game.
All right,
under the sun.
These are the kinds of comments. If you leave comments of the caliber of the statement John just made, we'll read them live on air because they'll just fit right in with the rest of the program. If you would consider subscribing to subscribestar.com/TUA for all bonus content, you can support this ministry for as little as $1 a month. Any little bit helps. I do genuinely appreciate it. Next week, just to let you know, next Wednesday at 8:30, Dr. Ryan, or is he a doctor? That just popped into my head. Ryan Mullins. Yeah, he is his doctor, right?
Where'd you hear that one before? Huh?
Yeah, funny enough, yes. Ryan Mullins will be coming on the show. We'll be talking about A-theory, B-theory. We'll have a bonus piece with Ryan Mullins, specifically on the subscribestar.com/TUA platform. We're going to be doing exclusive Q&As there. So that is where you want to go to check out all of that stuff. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and read what I have here. And so it's this idea someone posed it to me, that we're basically slaves by definition if God created us for his purposes. We have no say in the matter. Now, there's one obvious way you can respond to that. That's false, because there's at least two faulty assumptions here. There's at least one that's absurd right from the get-go, and that is that freedom is synonymous with complete autonomy, right? Because I think that's the first faulty assumption there, is that in order to be truly free, to not be a slave, you have to have complete autonomy. And an easy counterexample right away is just to say, are children slaves to the parents? Right? Of course not. I mean, after all, a parent has all kinds of rules, perhaps very strict rules, and kids are punished if they don't obey those rules. Are the kids slaves? Well, we would say, of course not, for two reasons. One, because the parent has the children's best interest in mind. But number two, because the parent is a proper authority. And so I think the first thing we have to realize is that there are legitimate authorities and there are illegitimate authorities, and parents are a legitimate authority over their kids. It can be dead in 5 minutes without a parent keeping them from running in the street. And so that's just a good place, I think, to start off there. And of course, now that would be a question. If we're having the question about God, well, of course, the question is which God? And then the question is is that God a proper authority over human beings to have the right to set the rules for them, to tell them what to do? Does this God have their best interests at heart? Now, of course, I'm not going to go through all of the arguments for Christian theism on this episode. I'm going to, take the accumulation of all the episodes I've done on it, the interviewing apologists on arguments for God's existence. John has obviously done a lot of that on his channel. You could refer to countless other channels, Braxton Hunter's channel, Inspiring Philosophy's channel. And so, yes, so for the sake of the discussion I'm having, I am talking about Christian theism. And of course, on that worldview, God is a proper authority, and it's because he has the best interest first in mind. So that's the first faulty assumption, is that this idea of freedom is synonymous with complete autonomy. And once you recognize that that is off, you can dismiss the argument on those grounds alone. And this reminds me of, I was watching the Jordan Peterson podcast. Go check out last week's episode. We talked about him. And he had Jocko Willink on his podcast. And one of the things Jocko Willink was talking about is it's almost like a counterintuitive reality when you realize he was talking about in the context of extreme discipline has brought him the most freedom in his life. And that does seem counterintuitive, right? Why wouldn't freedom just be, I get to just do whatever I want. I don't ever have to worry about money. I can just sit on my couch, watch Netflix all day, and just pig out on food. Well, because then guess what? You're a slave to your laziness. You're a slave to your just immediate desires to just consume media and food and all of that stuff. But when you're disciplined, that brings real freedom. Why? Because now you're in control of your life and you can realize your purpose. And so this gets into the second faulty assumption, which is that I think this idea assumes that we can be whatever kind of beings we want to be, right? And so this is where I'm going to be talking a lot about the stuff Andrew Klavan has talked about on his show. And so one of the things he's discussed is at the center of our being, we are God-made persons. That is what we are. That is our telos, whether or not we realize it or not. We are God-made persons. And he's talked about one of the reasons Christianity is easy to ignore. One of the reasons Christianity is easy to turn away from, or for people to fall away from and forget about it, is because it's true. Because it's true. It's like science in that regard. Because science is true, one can believe all kinds of wacky things and ignore it, but still get the benefits of living in a world where science works. For example, science tells us that light can behave as a particle or wave depending on who observes it. If you've watched Inspiring Philosophy stuff, you know quantum mechanics tells us all kinds of crazy things. Atheists might argue
anything.
Yeah, atheists might argue it shows us that things can come into existence from nothing. Whether or not that's true, that's a scientific discussion that can be had. IP would argue that quantum mechanics shows us that the universe emerges from more fundamental information. But here's the thing. You don't have to know any of that. You don't have to understand the science behind the way light behaves or what light is or the quantum mechanics if you just want your cell phone to be able to send texts, right? If you just want to be able to type something in your cell phone and text your friend, you just want that to work. It doesn't matter what you believe about science. If you believe the earth is flat, for example, if you're one of these idiot flat earthers, it doesn't change the fact that when you go downstairs in the middle of the night and open the fridge, you want that fridge light to come on so you can see the food. Science just works. It doesn't matter if you believe in it or not. And it's the same thing with Christianity. It's just true whether or not we believe it. One can say they live in an atheistic universe, but guess what? They still treat their loved ones fairly and with respect. They forgive friends when they're wronged. The moral fabric of the universe just holds regardless of what you say about it. An example Andrew Klavan talked about was when powers conspire to kill the truth rises again, right? This is the Easter story. All the powers conspired to kill the truth incarnate, which is Jesus, and the truth rose again. And that's why you look at reality, and truth has a way of rising again. I mean, one of the things I considered talking about on the show was Steven Crowder. The powers that be conspired to get Steven Crowder off the YouTubes, off the internet. And guess what? He's back now because that's the way reality works, regardless of what you claim to believe about it. And now this gets into something kind of Andrew Klavan kind of carried that theme into his next episode, and he talked about the example he gave was that of a rainbow, which is it's just spectrums of light. This is kind of an idealist argument that IP might offer, right? It's just spectrums of light, and yet there is an objective experience we have of that rainbow. It's beautiful, but it's an experience we have, but it's an experience that is objective in reality. You can't experience the rainbow as a train, for example, because then you're no longer talking about reality. And the same is true of morality, right? It's an objective feature of reality. It's an experience we have. That's why you can't say things like abortion is right or morality is subjective or God doesn't exist and still be talking about reality, right? Now, why is all that relevant? Because the reason slavery was because humans were having their objective purpose violated, right? If person A kidnaps person B and forces person B to work for the purposes of person A, well, guess what? Person B's purposes, his purpose as a human being, is being violated, and he's being taken against his will to work for the purposes of person A. That's what makes slavery, right? It's also why autonomy alone is a shallow view of freedom. One can imagine a particularly tyrannical parent, one that forces the kid to have a particular career and insert whatever other tyrannical behaviors you'd like. But a good parent is one who guides their children to discover their own unique purpose. Now, of course, that comes with restrictions on harmful behaviors, rules for how to live properly, and eventually the kid is going to grow up and do whatever they want. But the parent, the good parent, has to do what's best to give their children the tools to live a meaningful life and then let them go. And God does do that for us. Even if the atheist was right that there's something nefarious in the idea that God has his own purposes for our lives, guess what? The atheist is free to do whatever he wants, right? He doesn't just have to decide, well, God, I'm going to live for you. No, he can go do whatever he wants. So he's wrong even on that front. And this is why truth with a capital T, is the ultimate standard of freedom. Because it's only when you experience the world as it really is that you can discover your unique way in which you experience it. You can discover that you're a God-made person. And that's another reason the atheist is wrong. We aren't slaves to God because God is not violating our purpose. He's helping us discover it, right? Our telos is beings made in the image of God, and our ultimate purpose is to be found in that. And there's ultimate freedom in that. Just like the good parent, God wants us to discover our own unique purpose in life and live that out to the fullest. As Christians, we understand that Jesus was the ultimate God-made person. Jesus lived a life that was maximally truthful, maximally courageous, and maximally subservient to the will of his Father. And anyone who has experienced that to one degree or the other knows the freedom that brings. And here's what I'll end on is, ironically, the atheist who has claimed to be a slave, if he lives in God's world, has actually made himself a slave. Why? Because, again, this goes back to the idea of Christianity being true whether or not you realize it. If the devil is whispering in your ear and telling you all the things, actually, you should serve your own desires. Actually, you should ignore this. Well, but you believe in a version of reality that doesn't have the devil in it. Well, you start to think, well, yeah, maybe my desires are the ultimate purpose. Maybe my short-term happiness, my immediate gratification is the ultimate meaning in my life. And you start to listen to that and follow that. But of course, that brings slavery. Because why? Because now you're a slave to your own desires, right? The atheist wants to take the freedom God has given him and use it to violate his own purpose as a God-made person. He's decided his purpose lies in his desires. That immediate happiness is the goal rather than long-term meaning. And when we live like that, we become slaves to our own desires. We become the center of our own universe. When we don't see how reality really is, we are in bondage to ourselves. But when we see reality for what it really is, when we discover that God made it and created us as a God-made person and gave us a special place in that reality with our own unique purpose in that reality, then and only then can we truly be free. And that's kind of how I wrote the end and wrapped it up in a nice, neat little bow. I've talked for long enough. John, let me give it to you, sir.
I don't know what to say. I'm an apologist, so I don't have a script like some people here. No, we can place it on the individual level instead of, because I think you covered the grand scale of God with humanity and humans' will with God's will and purpose and all that. But like on the individual level, if you ask yourself, how do I live my life according to God's purpose and yet at the same time have unique freedom? Because most Christians don't hear the voice of God and hear a specific calling. It becomes obvious.
Sure.
Like on my own Christian level, I think what I'm doing is pretty obvious because it's going well, and apologetics just clicks in my head, and philosophy just clicks in my head, and everything just seems to connect. But I like St. Augustine when he says the greatest freedom is to live in accordance to the truth. And in The Problem of Pain, there's a great quote from C.S. Lewis. I think it's the first part addressing human suffering. Human will truly becomes truly creative and truly our own when it is wholly God's, and this is the one of many senses in which he that loses his soul shall find it. And Calvin also talks about, when he talks about the fear of the Lord, that to know yourself, you must know God. So when we know God, you get that uniqueness, is sort of what I'm arguing, I guess, or stating. And even using thoughts from Cicero, this is a thought I've been thinking about for a while, where and it also goes with natural theology. There's this broad purpose of humanity that we're teleologically made, of course, in the image of God. If you're a Christian, even theistic evolutionally, that's not a word, or the design view. There's a quote. I want to do a video on this, but basically, it's like we have our nature, and our nature must live in accordance to what God calls us. In the Christian context, love the Lord your God with all your mind, soul, heart, and strength, and love thy neighbor as thyself. That's how the law is wrapped up in those two greatest commandments. And then from there, I think you can easily live a unique life and have your own unique purposes in which how you live your life. There's no such thing as soulmates, so two Christians can fall in love and raise a family and still be in accordance with the will of God. Be serving the kingdom and all that. I think people are made more clear that they have specific purposes and they have the choice to follow that. And I think most real Christians will follow that if something like that is clear to them. But on the flip side, you can still have fun in your life, have unique things going on, not be. And something that doesn't help are these churches where people grow up, and the whole KJV, young earth creationism type crowd is tied with these, where you have to live a certain strict life. Like, I grew up in a household where like Yu-Gi-Oh and Pokemon were almost like demonic, crazy stuff like that. And when you grow up in a mindset like that, you're going to think almost anything is sin. While it's like, no, a Christian can drink and go to parties. It's called temperance. It's not called drunkenness. A Christian can watch Yu-Gi-Oh and play Yu-Gi-Oh cards as long as there's no devil worship in it, typically speaking.
Right.
And those are the types of freedoms that I think the atheists think we lose. Now, granted, a lot of people, sex, their sexual identity, sexual culture, sexual pleasure, that is their whole identity, and that's what they, as Lewis sums up sin to be, you follow one thing, one part of your human nature, and you follow that at all costs, when that is not in the alignment of how God, in this broad sense of how humanity should live, in the proper sexual context of marriage between two Christians, or at least two people who love each other and then are married in that secular context. Sex outside marriage, as a pretty general rule, is not a good thing and is not in accordance with the way reality is, and that is how God has set things up. So that's one way we recognize God's purpose and God's will, is when we are doing something outside of reality and things just don't seem to go well, and that's just God's rebalancer. You're going, as the flat earthers say, since you brought that up, you're going towards the ice wall, you're almost falling off the edge of the earth, when you start going against that. But those are some thoughts I have. I used to have to do the Cicero podcast with Matthew because I'm horrible, but maybe I'll do a video on that, because I had some interesting thoughts on that.
Right. Now,
do you have any comments or questions of what I had, because that may trigger my brain some more?
Yeah, I went on my spiel. John just did his. We'll probably dedicate the rest of the time of the show to taking questions. If you guys would like to go ahead and put them down in the chat. One thing I may say. Again, I've stated pretty clearly for my argument, I'm presupposing the Christian worldview. Now, I'm not purely presupposing, I'm doing it for the sake of this episode. Obviously, you can go with the back catalog. There's been plenty of arguments for the Christian worldview on this channel, on both our channels. But yeah, you made a good point too. One of the things the atheists, I think the atheist kind of sees his bias to seeing this as a form of slavery is, well, look at all the rules God has for us, and I shouldn't have to follow those rules, if I don't want to. And then you were kind of pointing out that I think there's a lot of places that Christians have gone too far with those rules and made rules that aren't something that should be found in the Bible, right? That called things sin that aren't sin.
It's this thing called dualism, where you make a huge distinction between like culture and what's Christian, and dualism would sort of say that there are these things, these secular things, and then no, Christian habits, while I think strong thinking Christians are like, oh no, some so-called secular things, so-called secular music and all that really isn't outside of Christian context. It's just, you have to have the virtues with that, temperance, like with the whole alcohol thing. I personally don't drink. That's a choice, but I think Christians can easily drink as long as they have temperance with it. And my whole view is there has to be an individual uniqueness, but at the same time, reality is such a way that if your will is not in accordance with that, you can't have a fun life. You can have an instant gratification life, but like in the long run of things, you're just furthering yourself from reality. And the modern church, has honestly gotten rid of that unique individual level, where like living a Christ life has to be this way, and you can't have these other fun things going on in your life, or those are distractions or whatnot. Well, it's like, no, you can have that as long as your faith can be testing and you're living with trembling and fear. If you're living like
as long as it's brought into accord with a higher meaning. So let me finish what I was going to say, which is I was also raised in a similar type of environment where, like, Yu-Gi-Oh, Pokemon, right? These are demonic things. And so obviously Christians can go too far that way. Now, here's the problem: is the response to it can't be to say, well, that's an extreme, so I'm going to go to the other extreme, which is like the progressive Christians. Well, whether it's your sexual behavior can be whatever you want. Homosexuality, that's fine with God. Who cares? It's all good, right? So they say, well, they went too far and called everything sin, and everything clearly isn't sin. So we're going to go too far the other way, and basically nothing is sin. That can't be the answer either. And
there has to be a rationality to it.
Yeah, and the thing is, you can even make really pragmatic arguments for that. So sex is a perfect example. Let's not even say sex inside the context of marriage. Let's just say sex in the context of a monogamous relationship between a man and a woman. You can make a very pragmatic argument for that, which is just to say, if that was the case, if God's prescription for sex was the way it played out in every single circumstance, there would be no sexually transmitted diseases. That wouldn't be a thing. You wouldn't have the emotional heartbreak that comes with just having multiple sexual partners and then forming emotional, spiritual attachments with those people and then leaving. Like, you can make pragmatic arguments for these places, and this is where it comes in. Jocko's discussion with Jordan Peterson comes in, which is discipline brings freedom, because when you bring your own personal desires, especially sexual desires, in under your control, then guess what? You have freedom to not be a slave to them. Right? If you're a slave to have sex because you're tempted every time, and then you didn't form a proper connection with that person, and then they leave you, you're more emotionally destroyed than you would have been otherwise. And so you can make pragmatic arguments to these. And then to your point about kind of the individualization of things, drinking is a good example. Again, you can go too far and be a drunkard and just go out drinking and driving all the time. That's sinful. But then the other extreme would be if you have a drop of alcohol, that's sin, right? And so it's like you're saying, drink at moderation. And suppose, like you're saying, the church has strict rules. It's like, well, how are you living a God-fearing life and a life for God if you go out drinking with friends? Okay, well, here's a question. What is your individual purpose for God? Does it have to be a ministry, or could it be, you do the best way to show those closest to you the love of God? And let's say it is some type of ministry. Well, doesn't your mental health affect the way you're going to perform in the ministry? And then doesn't spending time with friends affect your mental health? And then maybe the social situations you're in with your friends, you have a drink or two. So all of this stuff correlates. It's not, you can't have fun things. You can't be happy. You can't do anything that's enjoyable because you always have to be serving some kind of ultra high purpose. It's like, no, you got to take care of yourself, got to take care of your mental health. So you got to do those things that make you happy. God does care about that. I mean, it's all over the Bible, all over the Old Testament, that God gave us alcohol as a gift to use. He gave us friendships and relationships to use. And so the idea that it's always just, we have to be, say, on the road preaching the gospel, that's the only thing we can do. Yeah, I think that's wrong.
I wanted to comment
and the reason I linked Andrew Clavin was not to advertise memberships to his website. It was because in that episode that I linked, he talks about the kind of stuff I was talking about in the opening.
I wanted to comment on something. Oh, so to make a Seinfeld joke where George does not have sex, his mind opens up. As jokingly as that is very true. And this goes with all addictions. If you're addicted to something, your mind focuses on that, and ultimately, your truth, your reality, will change because of those addictions. Even your epistemology will change, and you have the whole neuroplasticity thing that will definitely be affected by that, and it literally numbs your mind. This is why I'm a virtue ethicist, because there's certain virtues that you have to make a habit to protect your mind, and to try and live that out. I fail at times, like many times, but I try, as much as pathetic as that sounds. I try to be a virtue ethicist, but it's difficult with some, because psychology is a huge thing. But when your mind is so focused on something, ultimately it becomes numb. And this is why Augustine says to live in accordance to the truth, what your mind is naturally supposed to discover and to act in accordance with. That is the greatest freedom, because it allows for more available options in your mind. And I'm trying to, I know what I have in my head, but I'm trying to say what I'm trying to say without trying to sound like a guru or a mystic or whatnot, or like a Gnostic.
Right.
Because like when your mind is clear, this is annoying. Just read Aristotle and Cicero. You'll be good, and Augustine.
Yeah. So I'm going to. I'm sorry. Were you not finished with your thought?
Oh no. To respond to Joseph Rogers, John is a moron. Very true.
I think he says Mormon, but that's okay.
Oh. Well, no. Wait, more. No, that's more. Am I an idiot? Am I a moron for reading that as Mormon? My brain literally cannot tell if that is Mormon or moron. Is there?
It's Mormon. It's a Mormon. So I don't know how this question should be interpreted. I'm going to interpret it my own way.
I can't look past this, Stelman. I'm looking at the comment. Why is my brain reading this as moron?
Because you're dyslexic. So
okay,
I'm going to interpret this question the way I see. This sounds like something you would ask an atheist, right? What's the best argument he thinks is for Christianity? And then why does he think it fails? Obviously, neither of us are going to think that the best argument for Christianity fails. However, to respect the way the question is phrased, I'm going to tell you why I think it fails in the minds of some. So for me, and of course I shift on this, I change on this, the best argument for Christianity is the resurrection, right? When one honestly looks at the historical evidence, I know there's a lot of Matt Dillahunties out there that would make their arguments. I think the arguments from guys like who debate him, like Mike Winger, stand. Guys like Michael Koenig, Gary Habermas, who's been on the channel. The best, when one looks at the historical evidence for the resurrection, it is as certain, if not more certain, than most historical facts we take for granted, like the existence of Aristotle and his writings, Plato and his writings. We have more historical evidence for the resurrection than the idea that Alexander the Great ever marched or did any of the things that he did. And so if one wants to throw out the resurrection, guess what? Throw out Alexander the Great and all of his conquests, because we have more historical evidence for the resurrection than that. The historical resurrection is as solid as solid a historical fact as almost anything is. It requires one presupposition on my part, and that is I see reality in a way that is not strictly naturalistic. I don't see the world in a way that is materialistic. I don't look at the world and think that all that exists are materials, all that exists are molecules, all that exists are physical stuff. And this actually, kind of goes back to a point I made, that, morality. I think morality is one of the most real things we experience about the world, and that's not a physical thing. It's not, as Frank Turek says, it's not a fact you can reach out and touch somewhere in the world. So, the idea that you view the world in a way that doesn't forbid anything non-material, let's say, then the resurrection is possible. And of course, you can make the other argument that maybe you have all these back arguments for God that you bring to it. I think that's obviously cumulative case is probably one of the best approaches here. But I would even just say having a non-discriminatory view of reality that doesn't rule out the resurrection ahead of time, that's the only presupposition I have to make. Now, you might say, why does it fail? And I think the reason it fails, and I mean this in a subjective sense, the reason it fails in a subjective sense is because a lot of people don't have that view of reality. Matt Dillahunty doesn't have a view of reality that says the resurrection is possible, no matter what the historical evidence says. And I also think another reason it fails is, again, one of the facts about reality is powers conspire to kill the truth.
Well, it also fails because, have you ever heard of Mithras, Horus, Osiris?
I want to finish my point.
Dionysius.
I mean, look at what's going on in the world of politics today. That is the left's MO. It is the powers that be, the elites, conspiring to kill the truth. That's what it is. That's why it fails. Not because there's anything wrong with the evidence for it. Not because the facts about reality are wrong. It fails because people aren't willing to see reality in that way. So that's my answer to that. But you can have a totally different answer if you'd like to.
I'm very much Nietzschean. I'm very Nietzschean and Kierkegaard, like, when it comes to human epistemology. I think it begins with human psychology, and this is why, if you don't properly train your mind or live in accordance with truth, your psychology is ultimately how you're going to view the world. And it's like the ultimate confirmation bias that you're either aware of and you just stuff in the back of your head, or you're just unaware of, and that's why you can't find the truth, perhaps, or live in accordance with it. So in my mind, once we sort of articulate the evidence ad hocly through our own biases. I may have accused Pine Creek of this in the past, but, like, after reading Nietzsche, when reading Beyond Good and Evil, and I'll say the reverse, why most non-believers are non-believers, because he'll say most Christians are not Christians for the philosophical reasons or for truth seeking. I'll just simply say that I don't think non-believers are non-believers for so-called intellectual reasons. I think they most certainly attempt it, but I think ultimately there's psychology at play and our own biases. And, you can take into account the noetic effects of sin and the whole Reformed tradition. I just think it's past prior deliberations that aren't godly and all that. But why people don't see that? Perhaps it's that, or perhaps they just have the bad reasons, and, But I think the best argument is from all the evidence, because I don't think it's fair to separate one piece of evidence from all the other. I think it makes a coherent net and chain.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Oh, no, I agree. I agree with Doug.
Where?
Emotional reasons are the most powerful reasons. We have to fight against these to find truth. No, I agree with that. That's why I read. That's why I study philosophy.
Yeah, I mean, I get what he's getting at. I can't identify with all with it at all. That's just not how my brain works. Even if what he said is true of most Christians, it's just not true of me. So I just can't.
I think when it comes, I
think that's all of us to some degree with any belief, though, not specifically religion.
Well, I think when in the context of, let's say, Christians have real experiences that just relate to their life and their past, and it's just everything that naturally clicks, and they don't have to ad hocly rationalize and all that. I think I think people are rationally justified in their properly basic beliefs. That the whole Alvin Plantinga thing. Because I think God does make clear to some. And then others, others actually need evidence and need those reasons. They don't have the gift of faith, which is not belief against evidence, but is rather confidence with what you know and have experience. Because those people, their epistemology is experientialism. And you could, I think, argue that God uses that epistemology to convince people of his existence instead of the philosophical arguments. But the philosophical arguments are helpful when you have the right metaphysics because they just verify your own experiences. Mm-hmm. So I think I'm not talking about concert experiences and all that. I'm talking about like real life stories and all that.
Yeah. So this comment strictly as read, emotional reasons are the most powerful reasons. We have to fight against these to find truth. I think that is true. That's partially true, but the two things don't have to actually be in conflict, right? If depending on how you live your life, because I would say this can be true for any belief. It doesn't have to be a religious belief. It can be a religious belief. It can be a non-religious belief. It can be a political belief. It can be whatever belief you want. We have emotional reasons that are usually the most powerful us, and we have to put those in check to find truth. Now, here's the thing: if you're an integrated person, I would say you're philosophically sophisticated, you will bring your emotions in alignment with the truth, and then the two things don't have to be in conflict. So let's just take falling in love with a girl. You can be emotionally wrapped up into a relationship and the person's actually not good for you at all, right? And maybe you actually have to fight your emotions to find the truth to, say, break up with the person because they're not right for you at all. But then take a person who is right for you and you should be with. Guess what? Those emotions can now be brought into alignment with actual objective reasons why this person is a good match for you and maybe you should marry them. So while emotions can be deceitful, they don't have to be. They can be brought into alignment with the truth.
Well, if you have as Natasha Romanoff says, love is for children. If you have that view, just you're seeking the cheap romance and someone to fill that void because you're not doing what you should be doing for yourself. Then yeah, that's going to numb your mind because it's not the virtue ethicist view of love that St. Paul has. Love is patient, love is kind, love is truthful, does not hold record of wrongs. That whole list, because that is the type of love that literally is a strong virtue and inhabits all virtues. And requires, real sacrifice and actual truth seeking and all that. But I like to put it this way: let your mind guide your heart, and not your heart guide your mind. Because if your mind guides your heart, you realize certain emotions are just verifiers for certain truths we know or are experiencing. But if your mind is numb, then obviously you're going to just have irrational emotions that aren't connected to anything and are meaningless.
Yeah.
And someone placed an address in the comments. I don't know what that is for.
So I like this question because it's something I've been thinking about since I had Baron Brass on my channel. Because he's a deist, and one of his objections to Christianity itself is the Trinity. And so when it says, how could a Christian explain the Trinity to how the Trinity works? Sorry, to someone who doesn't understand that. Well, I of course want to address the person specifically. I want to ask them why is they don't understand it. What is it to them that seems unreasonable? Because to me, Nabil Qureshi gave the best answer to this because he just addresses it directly instead of trying to give some analogy. I think analogies, there's the comical video with the two Irish guys. Come on, Patrick, that's modalism, Patrick. And because it's funny because most of these analogies do commit some kind of heresy along the way, and I mean they're good for kids, I guess, but they don't really help clarifying the answer. So I like just taking it directly and just saying, well, what we're claiming is there's one being and three persons. Now, I can understand why someone who has a more physicalist view of humanity might not latch onto that, right? Why that something like that might seem contradictory, but that's why I'd want to address it individualistically. Do you have that view of people, of humans? Do you think that our being is identical with our personhood? Because at least on the face of it, what you can say about the Trinity, you can say a lot of things about the Trinity. What you can't say is that on the face of it, it's a blatant contradiction, right? Because it's not claiming he's one God and three gods, or that he's one person and three persons. It's claiming he's one being and three persons. And listen, you could give a hypothetical I gave when Baron Brass on the channels. Imagine someone told you they visited another planet. Imagine we really did land on Mars. The astronauts really landed on Mars and then came back and told us what they saw. And what they saw was like these beings, but the beings had like two minds, right? Like two separate brains, and the minds, like one spoke and had a certain voice, and the other spoke and had a different voice. You might say that's absurd. You could say a lot of things about it. You could say I don't believe it. I find it highly unlikely. What you can't say is it's inherently contradictory. The idea that there'd be these two minds, because you could just think of two heads and then put the heads together and just have to keep the brains separate. So anyway, I know that's probably not answering the question that well.
I would just read the Trinity controversy. Where is it on my bookshelf? If you look up Trinity controversy, it should just come up. But just read St. Augustine's chapter in that book, and you'll be like, oh, this isn't a problem. Because he gives analogies that don't describe it dimensionally and mechanistically satisfactory of that most people probably will want, because some people just have unreasonable standards. But he gives plenty of analogies where it's like, oh, three persons in one being is not an unreasonable belief.
Yeah. I don't, again,
he
because
uses,
my
he
view
uses
of
the
humanity,
analogy of the mind and love. And, you can be like, well, love isn't metaphysically a thing. Okay, but hypothetically, if it is, this is what it would be. And hence, God can be three persons in being and be the metaphysical grounding of love. And this is how love comes into existence. Two persons bring this thing called love into existence. And then you have that unity between the three things, three unique things. Now, of course, you don't have three persons in the mix. Or with the human mind, and I forget. I think he goes with Aristotle's view of the soul, appetites and all that, and connects that with the mind, and then uses that as an analogy. Or I'm not going with partialism here, but I like the view of time, especially if you have sort of like a block view, because like even on a block view, past, present, and future would still be real things. That time would be this one huge block, but everyone experiences it differently. You have the past, which would still be, it's not as objective as atheist wants to say, but it's still a thing, and uniqueness view of time, and so on and so forth. And you just have these different reference points that really are past, present, and future of human consciousness. They're an experience of one thing. That could be sort of an analogy, I think, for the Trinity, perhaps. But like everything has its kinks and flaws, and it's just like at the end of the day, three persons, one being.
Especially because I'm not a B theorist. That's what we're going to be talking about next week.
But you'd be denying the metaphysical and not the logical coherence of it. You could maybe say there's logical coherence to B theory, but with how I described it, since I described it that way, obviously there's no logical coherence, of course. But it's just an analogy. Stop
I don't know that there's logical coherence to the B theory. Probably one of the reasons I reject it.
I don't think there's logical coherence to your face. Just look at it.
There's logical coherence to it, but only in the sense if you kind of assume a temporal origin, which kind of then just throws off the whole thing.
Are we talking about B theory or your face?
No, the best way, I know I kind of went off on a rant there about the Trinity, and it was just a lot of jumbled thoughts, wasn't obviously the best way to answer it. Basically, I would just say the thing Nabil Qureshi said, which is if you look at humans, we are one what and we're one who, right? What we are isn't the same as who we are. So what am I? I'm a human being. John is a human being, right? But who I am is Spelman Smith Jr., right? And so God is, there's one what, there's one essence, there's one being, but there's three who's, there's three persons. And I think just putting it as simply like that is really the best way to understand it. I don't think there's anything contradictory there. I think an argument would have to be made to that effect, because I don't think it's inherent in the doctrine itself. Um,
I just removed the address because, well, I think my brain indirectly listened to the comment below it because I'm a slave to comments below other comments.
yeah.
And I think I ad hocly just rationalized that subjective subconscious psychology that controls all my beliefs and actions. So I can make myself feel I actually have this thing called freedom of the will. And I ad hocly justify that by saying, it's an address, it's public or private information. You should probably keep it that way.
Yeah. So
Just so.
this question: do you think the problem of evil can convince someone that life is meaningless? Well, of course it can. I mean, and it doesn't even have to be the formulation of the argument. You could just say that suffering by itself can convince someone that life is meaningless, right? Because when you're suffering, that is the meaning to your life. Like right there in that moment, especially when you're suffering something particularly tragic, you know there's a meaning to life. That's it. It's the suffering. You can't deny it. You can't run from it. You can't ignore it. It's right there. It's in your face, right? This is the kind of what Jordan Peterson lays out. It's like when you're suffering, that's the meaning. And so now maybe that's kind of oxymoronic to the idea of it can convince you life is meaningless, but if you dwell on that and that becomes everything to you, then of course you're going to become nihilistic, and then you're going to suffer more. The question is there a mode of being? Is there a mode of truth? Is there something to believe that allows you to transcend the suffering, that allows you to stare the suffering in the face and say, it's worth it? And of course, I do think that Christianity offers that to people. I think it offers you, modeling your life after Christ. I mean, Christ, again, to use Jordan Peterson kind of language here, is the perfect archetype because you have the most innocent person suffering the most tragic thing. He was betrayed by his friend. He's innocent. He's suffering a brutal death. And what does he do? He picks up his cross and he stumbles uphill. He looks suffering in the face and he confronts it voluntarily. And he says, it's worth it because of what's the ultimate purpose of Jesus' mission transcended any suffering that he went through. And I think when we model our lives after Christ, we can have the same hope, that there's a meaning to our life that transcends the suffering. And so for me, when you look at the problem of evil, it does the opposite. For me, the problem of evil convinces me that there is objective meaning to life because, of course, I've sought the solutions to the problem of evil and why God allows it. I think God allows it precisely for the reason he allowed it to happen to Jesus, because there is a greater meaning that comes from the suffering.
I think a huge thing is going to be as rational and cold, but at the same time as rational as I can be. A huge stumper for people are individual cases that just don't seem like they have any purpose at all, like any moral teleology at all.
Right.
And obviously we are pattern-seeking beings, as the naturalists would want to say, and since we don't have that answer, we can't live out rationally, or we can't seem to live without this unanswered question. And, the naturalist or atheist will always go, well, why can't we say we don't know? And it's like, well, on these individual cases, they want to try and argue that intrinsically one case that we cannot fathom having any moral teleology somehow is a defeater. Well, in the long run, I think it's just our own biases at play again, where it's like we have to have the answer, and if we don't, we're like not able to live with ourselves.
Yeah.
Or even live with belief in God. And it's like,
and even not having the answer doesn't.
And I think it's a virtue. I think it's a virtue.
Doesn't
to. Sorry. I was just saying. I think it is a virtue to be able to continue looking at the truth and looking past that individual case, and being able to say, yeah, there are questions I just don't know. Because let me tell you, I have. There was once a man I really admire who had much to say on this, but I don't admire him anymore. But he once said that he has many questions but has no doubts. And that's my mind, where it's like I have questions. There are certain life experiences I have. I'm like, I need to know the answer, but I'm willing to live without them, since there are certain truths that I think can't be ignored, even with individual cases of suffering. You know.
Well, and here's an individual case of suffering where a question was asked and then an answer wasn't given. Now, that didn't mean the answer didn't exist, and it didn't mean the individual didn't get the answer in the right context. But here's a question that was asked. Father, why have you forsaken me? Jesus was suffering. He asked that question. Why? He wanted to know why his father had forsaken him. Here he lived out a life that was maximally subservient to the will of his father. He did everything his father willed, and his father forsook him, and he wanted to know why. Now, we know the reason why, and the reason why is because Jesus had to take not just some of the punishment that we deserve, but all of it. And all of it was what we deserved was for the Father to forsake us and leave us on our own. Instead, he forsook Jesus in our place so that he doesn't have to forsake us. And Jesus got that answer. But in the moment, the suffering was so bad, he asked the question. He despaired in the immediate, I would say, comfort that the fulfillment of the mission would bring out. Right? People have said, am I accusing Jesus of doubting? No, I'm not accusing Jesus of doubting. I'm saying I think he despaired in some kind of temporal comfort at that moment that the fulfillment of his mission would bring about. And yeah, so I think if the Bible doesn't answer that question right away when it's asked, and it's asked by God himself, then the fact that we have individualized questions that aren't answered, I think, like Jesus, our attitude should be, well, God might not have answered that question for me in the moment that I wanted it, but I'm still going to submit my life to the will of my Father, because there is a greater good that will be brought out from submitting to the will of the Father. So that would be my answer there.
I don't like it. No, I'm kidding.
Sorry. I was actually about to. Okay, this might be the last question we take because we're coming up on about an hour now. I want to read it before I always read them before I bring them up.
Yeah, you should read properly, or otherwise you start pronouncing Mormon moron.
All right. Really important question. When it comes to Jesus' suffering, how can he relate to us when he is God and doesn't have to worry about life? But when it comes to humans, we have limitations. Well, okay, I wish I could remember the exact episode it was, because Mike Winger. Oh, I know what it was. Go on. I know what the thumbnail says. It was part of Mike Winger's Mark series, his sermons that he does in the Mark series. And on the thumbnail, it says, I think it says something like, the thing that Jesus didn't know. And it's something like that. And he's referring to Jesus when he said he didn't know the time when the Father was going to return at the end of the world. And that is such a brilliant episode, because Mike Winger does such an excellent job of really delving into Jesus's humanity and what it means. When you say Jesus didn't have limitations like humans do, that's just false. You obviously, Jesus was fully divine and fully human, and in his fully divine nature, you might say there's not limitations. But in his fully divine nature, he has access to the Father.
Here's a question: does God have experiential knowledge? And if not,
don't derail me.
Oh well, I'm just throwing in here. Does God know what it feels like to be nailed and crucified? Like, does he know that? Does he have that feeling? He doesn't have neurons and so on. So, like, is God almost taking up a huge sacrifice by taking this suffering and feeling it with us? Sure, God would know what it does to the neurons and all the patterns and and all that, but like, does he have that human experience knowledge? And like, when he takes on human form, is this the first time he's feeling that? And then this gets into omniscience and all that, and I don't know how to work out the details with like
just to bring this
experiential knowledge. But
what I mean is, if he really is God, he doesn't really suffer because he can easily eradicate that suffering, but us humans can't. Well, again, that's just false. Of course, he really suffers. Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane is sweating drops of blood, and for a moment, I mean, here's a mind bender for you. the person of the Son actually at that moment has a will that's contrary to the will of the Father. He says, "Not my will, but your will be done." And otherwise, Jesus' will is to get out of the suffering. Jesus' will is to eradicate the suffering right away. But guess what? In being submissive to the will of the Father, says your will be done, and then the Father doesn't eradicate that suffering for Jesus, and he has to go through it to the end. Just like you're saying we can't eradicate it, yeah, we have to go through it to the end. And that's why Jesus deliberately submitted himself to the will of the Father to be like us. You're right that in some sense, yeah, Jesus could have just called on the angels, like when he's being tempted by Satan in the desert. Again, Jesus did have limitations. He was hungry. He was sleep deprived. Jesus got tired. Jesus did feel pain. He did have these limitations. And then the ultimate limitation was saying, hey, just like how all the other humans can on their own eradicate their suffering, I'm going to submit myself to the will of the Father so that I'm putting it in his hands. I'm saying, God, I'm putting it in your hands to eradicate the suffering if you want to, because that sure is what I want, but your will be done. So that's not only having the limitations of humans, but saying just like they can't eradicate their own suffering on a dime, I'm going to submit myself to the will of the Father so that I can't either. It's up to the Father at that point. And so, yes, in every sense of the word, Jesus was like us in that way. He suffered. He experienced the emotional distress of it all, and yeah. This is what always happens. Okay, so I've seen a couple of statements, not a lot of questions. So yeah, we are coming up.
I guess I'll comment and rudely interrupt as I usually do, only because you're a friend. I take advantage of your friendliness towards me, because I'm such a good human being. But anyway, I take the Anselm view of like the atonement, where it's like it's restoring God's honor. So it's like even if Christ doesn't take on the maximum amount of suffering, it's like he's still doing such an act that he doesn't have to do, and he's taking on our shame, and because of that, God's honor is restored, and now we can have this relationship with God because of that. And some goes into much greater detail and articulates it much more beautifully, but that's the view I sort of take. I also take that with the suffering. I think Jesus probably ascended into hell for 3 days, as the creeds say, and probably experienced what he probably experienced an eternity for 3 days, eternity of all the mental suffering you could say, or torment for 3 days, and suffered that, had that experience that probably felt like an eternity, and experienced an eternity of that. So yeah, because of that, I think that also helps us. It goes past was Jesus just a piece of meat, or did he really die? It's like, I think he experienced worse than death. So I take that along with the honor view.
All right, so yeah, so I do want to.
Can I answer this question?
Sure. Which one is it?
Advice for living in an ever more secular age. There's nothing wrong with listening to secular music. Okay, it depends.
How dare you?
If it's something that is clearly in violation with loving thy neighbor as thyself, and loving the Lord your God with all your mind, soul, heart, and strength, and if it is something that keeps you from loving God, then yeah, that could be distraction. But if you have temperance with so-called secular things, no, it's perfectly fine. But again, secular means so much, so it's like the world's view of sexual ethics versus a Christian's view. Yeah, no, obviously you should take the Christian's view over that, and there's many good reasoning. You can reason from just natural theology alone and how the way reality is. But sorry, I'll let Stoneman, since this is technically his show, but on my channel.
No, it's okay. No worries. No, good stuff. So yeah, again, if you're new to the channel, subscribe, hit that notification bell. Again, the best thing you can do for the algorithms is just comment. If you want to support this ministry, head on over to subscribestar.com/TUA. You can support for as little as $1 a month, but check out the different tiers there, see what's going on. And until next time, I really appreciate you guys being here again next Wednesday, 8:30. Ryan Mullins on the show, A Theory and B Theory of Time. What we're going to try to do is, again, get into some of the sophisticated stuff, make our our arguments, but again, we're going to make it very accessible for Christians who are very new to the topic. And more than that, one thing I'm going to try to do with him is not just kind of go off on kind of this, side deep philosophical issue, but I'm going to actually try to make it relevant to us as Christians, because some Christians might say, why would I even care about a topic like A theory and B theory? God's still sovereign over time in the universe. It's really irrelevant. I'm going to try to make the episode relevant to how we view God, how we view ourselves, how we view reality. And yeah, I really hope you guys enjoy that. See you next week. Thank you, John, for being here. And God bless everyone.